Now that the newest Nexus smartphone is finally here, let's see how it stacks up to the previous one. Hey, it's Josh Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And this is the Nexus 5 versus the Nexus 4. When it comes to the design, we are essentially looking at glass versus plastic. The Nexus 5 uses a soft touch plastic in its black version, and when you look at the back, the Nexus logo is in landscape mode next to a lens unit that is quite large but houses optical image stabilization. Contrast this to the Nexus 4, which has more of a dual glass-sided design. And on the back, you do have the Nexus logo there with the smaller camera unit, but also inside of the glass is the crystal reflection design that LG utilized not only in it, but also in the original LG Optimus G. When it comes to the feel in your hands, the Nexus 4 with its 4.7-inch screen does have a slightly better screen to use in one hand, plus its rounded look also made it rest pretty comfortably in the hand. Contrast that to the Nexus 5, which has a closer to 5-inch screen, but is still quite easy to use with one hand, all things considered. However, its profile is much more decisive, especially in its lines and in its corners. It has a much more rigid look to it compared to the very rounded look of the 4. While it can be argued that the Nexus 4 has an overall more unique design than the Nexus 5, I think that the 5's minimalistic design choices are more of a strong point rather than a detraction. The Nexus 4, given the time that it was released, came with a 1280 by 768 resolution screen that was capable of 318 ppi. For the time, it was definitely one of the better performing screens. However, the 1080p craze followed just behind it. So with that in mind, the Nexus 4 screen might be considered more mid-range today. And then we look to the Nexus 5, which is the logical next step in the evolution for the Nexus line. Yes, it does have the 5-inch screen at 1080p resolution, this time with 445 ppi that is in line with today's top-tier standards. Perhaps what is great about LG's display experience is that with the Nexus 4, despite being a much older phone, it does still hold up. So it's really up to you whether or not the resolution is something you need, as well as the pixel density. But sharpness on the Nexus 5, despite being great, does not necessarily blow the Nexus 4 out of the water, so it's just a matter of what size screen you really need. It is a battle of old versus new when it comes to the performance aspect. The Nexus 4 did come with the Snapdragon S4 Pro and the Adreno 320, which, for its time, was a pretty big deal because quad-core processing was not as common back then as it was today. However, today, this processing package is definitely starting to age when compared to the top-tier market that we have. When we move on to the Nexus 5, we see the evolution that we were pretty much all expecting. The Nexus 5 got the Snapdragon 800 clocked in at 2.3 GHz and the updated Adreno 330. Now, there's no doubt that, especially with the performance optimizations put into Android 4.4 KitKat, the Nexus 5 is one hell of a fast phone. Not only is multitasking as seamless as it has ever been, but also doing intensive tasks should be easy for all users. So with that in mind, the Nexus 5 might be worth the entrance fee already, just due to its performance aspect. It is in the hardware department that we find both of these phones more neck and neck than probably anywhere else, and that is because the Nexus 4 features have actually returned in the Nexus 5, well, most of them. For example, the 16 or 32 gigabytes of expandable memory are available in either device. However, as we've come to expect from the Nexus line, they are not expandable. Some features that return include Qi wireless charging, and even an LED notification light down right below the screen. When it comes to connections, there is one very stark difference. While the usual bevy of connections like GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and NFC do return, there is an important addition of full LTE support found on the Nexus 5. Those of you who were using the Nexus 4 and got sick of the HSPA Plus connectivity can look to the Nexus 5 for a much faster mobile internet experience. Despite the Nexus 5 having a 2300 mAh unit compared to the 2100 mAh unit found in the Nexus 4, we all hoped that the power-saving optimizations in Android KitKat would do their job. Unfortunately, that wasn't completely the case. Whereas the battery life on the Nexus 4 was actually pretty decent, this is also considering its lowered specifications. With the sheer power that the Nexus 5 is capable of underneath, having only a slightly larger battery made the battery life on this newer smartphone aggressively average. If you don't do too much on your Nexus 5, you'll probably see some decent longevity. However, it is when you ramp up your usage that you start to see very easily diminishing returns. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Nexus 5, battery life is probably its biggest setback. And that's considering one of the aspects of the Nexus 5 that held a lot of hope was its camera. Anybody who used the Nexus 4 probably looked to the Nexus 5 for a much better improvement. And for the most part, it does fulfill that hope. In the Nexus 4, we do have an 8 megapixel shooter that was capable of the photosphere inside of its app. Its app also got a little bit slimmed down and was more simplistic. However, its interface turned out to be a little bit cumbersome, and there weren't that many features inside of it other than perhaps HDR. But nonetheless, the picture quality that came out of the Nexus 4 was really just lackluster at best. Not only was color reproduction pretty lacking, it also produced pretty grainy shots no matter what kind of lighting you were in. Obviously, low light shots would suffer quite a lot. The Nexus 5 was given 8 megapixels as well, but this time that large lens unit housed optical image stabilization, which is a pretty big deal because it should help stabilize the camera during low light shots, therefore flooding in more light and creating much better shots. And for the most part, especially when you compare it to the Nexus 4, it performs pretty decently. I wouldn't say that it's the best feature of the Nexus 5, nor is it the best camera that is available today. However, I also wouldn't say that it is the worst. It does provide some decent photos, and in very good lighting, it does provide a nice picture for you to use. However, keeping HDR Plus on is probably more ideal because it processes the colors a lot better. When it comes to the software aspect, it is another evolution, this time from Jelly Bean to Delicious Kit Kat. Now, when we're talking about Jelly Bean, we see a much better perfection of the hollow design along with more optimizations. However, Jelly Bean was essentially the coming out party for Google Now, which was a wonderful new way of using search on your smartphone that became immensely popular and at the time was, to me, one of the best new enhancements available on Android. But of course, when you get a new Nexus smartphone, you get another iteration of Android, and this time we call it 4.4 KitKat. When it comes to the enhancements here, there are a lot of performance enhancements and the recent app screen has been made even faster. However, when it comes to the general look, the hollow design was almost completely reworked and now has a much flatter look that utilizes black and white with colored accents. But the main enhancements are, you guessed it, in Google Now, mostly in its integration with the operating system. Google Now is now a home screen, a second home screen available all the way on the left, and you can still access it using the swipe up method from the home button. In an attempt to create an even more integrated experience, when you're on the home screens, you could just say, "Okay, Google," and it will bring up Google Now immediately for you for voice command search. Now, it is worthy of mention that the Nexus 4 will be getting the Android 4.4 KitKat update pretty soon, and that will put it more on par with the Nexus 5 in terms of that pure Android experience. But keep in mind that the Nexus 5, with its processing power, will probably do KitKat a little bit more justice than the dated hardware found in the Nexus 4. Now that the Nexus 5 is out in the wild, you will not be seeing the Nexus 4 in the Play Store anymore, especially for that wonderful price of $199 unlocked for the base model. You can find it at third-party vendors, but you probably won't find it at that low price. On the other hand, the Nexus 5 does come with a heftier price tag of $349. However, for an unlocked phone capable of everything the Nexus 5 is capable of, that is considered a bit of a steal. If you have the Nexus 4, perhaps everything the Nexus 5 does give you over your original phone would be worth the price of admission. And that question is a little bit harder to answer considering the Nexus 4 will be getting the software updates that allow it to be a little bit more on par with the Nexus 5. However, when it comes to the upgrade, it is up to you whether the Nexus 5's slightly better battery, slightly better camera, but its huge speed increase are worth the price of admission for you. There's one thing for certain, however. The Nexus 4 introduced us to a new model of buying and valuing our smartphones, and the Nexus 5 was the next evolution of that, and we wanted to see where that would go. All things considered, the Nexus 5 is the next logical step and does the Nexus line a lot of justice. If this is the kind of evolution we'll see in each and every smartphone, then I think we can be very positive about the future of our Nexus smartphone line. As always, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this comparison of the Nexus 4 and the Nexus 5. Stay tuned to Android Authority for all of the best coverage. Check out our full review of the Nexus 5 right over on the side over there, and don't forget to follow us on social media. All of our G+ links are down in the description below. And if you want to follow me from time to time, you can find me on Twitter or on other social media networks, usually under the name Josh Salutes. Drop us a like on our videos, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and share our videos because Android Authority is your source for all things Android.